Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, with my co-host, Jim Reske. Tonight, we're going to tackle at least one book, Ecclesiastes, which is one of the most fascinating books of the Bible. Don't you think so, Jim?
I love it, Greg. I love it. So actually, it's been my favorite book of the Bible for a long time.
Really?
Yes.
You have like a favorite verse from the book of Ecclesiastes, or certain passages?
Different passages, but just love the overall feel of it. So, by the way, it's great to be with you tonight. Just for our listeners, what we're doing tonight is what we usually do. I'm going to be teaching on the book of Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs together next week. And so what Greg and I do is kind of have a podcast where we read it together, or read some passages, look at it and talk about it and wrestle with it together. Kind of cold, but we, go through it. And then we'll take the actual talk that we give and post that. And then we have the debrief, or what, I forget what we're calling it, Greg, but the post-op, the call where we go back and say, all things we want to say. The
after talk, the talk we wish we would have given.
Exactly. The repair work. Wish I hadn't said that or whatever. So we'll do that later. But this is the pre-talk for Ecclesiastes, and maybe if we go a little crazy, Song of Solomon.
The cool thing about Ecclesiastes is it's all about the search for significance, or the quest for contentment, and the pursuit of purpose in life. I mean, those topics, these are like huge topics that are addressed in this book. And I pulled out one of my old Bibles, you probably have a Bible like this, like I've got duct tape on it.
Yeah.
It's the one Bible I used for many, many, many years.
Yeah.
And I have so many different verses underlined in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's all about those three things: significance, contentment, and purpose. It's just kind of fascinating because it's written by Song of Solomon, right? We know it's written by Solomon.
Well, most people think he doesn't actually say written. I am Solomon writing this. He says, I, the preacher, son of David, right? So who was the wise son of David? It's pretty obvious it's Solomon. He's pretty universally, even though he doesn't say in the actual text, I think it's been in tradition almost universally agreed that it's Solomon writing it.
Yeah. So what is your idea of like the overview of the book?
Well, it's part of wisdom literature. So I'll tell you why I like it so much in a personal level. I mean, when I gave my life to Christ when I was 14, and I remember sometime around that time, like when I was 14, sitting on the back deck and reading the book of Proverbs almost straight through it. And I remember not finishing it, but I read like 20 chapters in a row. And that was one of the first times I just read a whole chunk of scripture in a row. And I remember really distinctly, really impressing me how important wisdom was. How that's what Proverbs is, wisdom literature. If you live this way, life will go better. Live according to these biblical principles, good things will happen. And if you don't, curses, right? And it's the need for wisdom impressed me. And then not long after that, while I was still a teenager, I remember reading Ecclesiastes and thinking, wow, this is so different. And the feeling I had at the time was it's so authentic. This is someone really, really bearing their soul and wrestling. What does it really mean? What is life about?
It's experiential.
Good word, Greg. You're right. It's experiential, right? That's really good.
It's so much about, it's almost, and this is why it fits Solomon so well, right? Because he had all the wealth, all the riches. So he could just go all in and try stuff.
Yeah.
And so you see, one of the big themes is everything is vanity. Everything is vanity. And
Right.
there's the vanity of doing things. There's the
Right.
vanity of having things. There's the vanity of being.
Doing,
Uh,
having, being. That's interesting. It's a good way to think about it.
yeah,
That's
that's one of the outlines that I kind of discovered as I was doing some research. Everything's vanity, chapter 1. Chapter 2, the vanity of doing things. Chapter 3 to 6, the vanity of having things.
mhm.
And then chapter 7 through 9, the vanity of being. So I'm not, I haven't gone much deeper than that, but yeah, so
That's interesting. It's not quite the way. By the way, what translation are you using when you say vanity? Because I think a lot of the translations say vanity of vanities,
right.
says the preacher. All is vanity and striving after wind as it opens. And I think it's the NIV that I was looking at that says meaningless, meaningless.
Yes. And that's the version that I kind of grew up with, is the NIV 1984 version.
Okay.
But the vanity, I think, is King James.
Yeah, I think so.
I think
Vanity of
it's
vanities. And I think
yeah.
New American Standard, which I grew up with, Vanity of Vanities, New American Standard.
Oh, is
But
it? Okay.
I like meaningless, meaningless. Similar meanings, but that a slightly different feel to a modern audience to say it's all meaningless, it's all pointless.
So yeah, so when you teach this, what kind of things are you going to hit?
Well, so that outline you just gave was interesting. That's not the way I was going to approach it. I was going to go at the beginning and say that at the beginning he sets out his disillusionment. It comes really out in chapter 1, and I'm going to read a bunch of chapter 1 together as a just as a group. That's where it starts out. Vanity of vanities, or meaningless, meaningless, says the preacher. All's meaningless. And then early on in chapter 2, he really goes through 3 ways that he tried to find meaning in life and how they all fail, through achievement, through great causes, and through pleasure. And I should say, as always, as only universally, a lot of my thoughts on this are informed by Tim Keller's sermons that I've listened to on this. And this other website I often go to called preceptaustin.org, which summarizes a number of commentaries. But Keller, I remember sitting in his church listening, and we attended there and preaching on this. And I remember him talking exactly those things. Like, there's 3 different ways you can live life. You can have an achievement. He used the word cluster, an achievement cluster, a cause cluster, or a pleasure cluster. I'm not sure what the word cluster means or adds to it, but it was basically an achievement-based life, a cause-based life, and a pleasure-based life. And I immediately felt at the time, because I lived in these 3 different cities, that a cause-based life was like DC, Washington, because we had lived in Washington before we went to New York. And everyone's there for causes. It's all cause-based, right? You're there to get your side elected. Everyone says this election we're facing is the most important of our lifetime because everything's at stake. We got to get our side in. And if you're not there for political parties, you're there for some lobby group, for some cause, right? You're fighting for your cause to,
That's interesting.
And
So
DC,
what city do people go for the achievement-based life?
New York, baby, New
New
York,
York?
New York.
Okay.
And I think about New York. I might depends how much time I have next Saturday, Greg. I might tell some stories because there's parts of New York history that a lot of New Yorkers I knew about. This, like I gave it like this historical event, that New York obviously was a Dutch colony originally, then so it was established. But sometime in the 1600s, the British sailed a couple warships down from Boston into the harbor, and everyone woke up, and there's these gunships. New York is, Manhattan's an island; it's exposed on the Hudson, and they woke up, and there's these British gunships with these guns aimed at a mostly wooden city. And the mayor at the time said, "We're going to fight. Everybody fight." And all the merchants said, "Oh, no, we're not. No, we're not." Down went the Dutch flag, up went the British flag. And it was more like a hostile takeover than a war at all. And it's
So there was no fighting.
no fight. In fact, it all went on the merchants were open for business the very next day. It took a couple months for the British to okay, we own this now. We're going to change the court system. And anyway, it was just a takeover and almost a real estate deal. But the part of it that is so emblematic for New York is that New York, when I was in DC, so much was all about the elections and even if you didn't work in politics, you still thought about who's in power, who's not. It meant everything. New York was like, yeah, that one side wins, one side loses. Who cares? There's a change in power.
Let's just
Okay.
do business.
Am I long the market? Am I short the market? Is that good for fixed income? Is it good for is it up, down? How do I make money off this? I really don't care. And it's about money. It's about achievement. There's a totally different world and different attitude than DC, which is all about, no, this is so important. And the New Yorkers say, yeah, kind of laugh at that. Yeah. It's really important. Good. How do I make money?
That is really interesting. And then are you brave enough to call out some cities that are pleasure-based?
LA. Because
LA.
I spent a summer in LA living with a friend of mine. Not that I know much about it. There's millions and millions of people there. I just spent one summer there, but it seemed like such a pleasure-based city. Everything is and that's a very big business climate. I know it's very intense and busy. So it's not like everyone's goofing off, but there's such a feeling of feeling good all the time, looking good all the time, almost like kind of being tanned and relaxed is your God-given right in LA. It just feels like a pleasure-based city. Someone might argue, he might say, no, Vegas is Sin City. That's pleasure-based. I might have a better example, but I always thought LA was like that just because I had lived there for a time.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Well, one thing I love about this, this book and the fact that he brings this out is it's all about the void. It's all about the void in every human heart. And I love chapter 3, verse 11, where it says, God has put eternity in the hearts of men.
Yes.
And yet they cannot understand, they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end.
Yeah.
That we were made for eternity. God made a void in us that only he can fill, but we try to fill it through achievement or causes or pleasure. Yeah. And we're constantly trying to fill that void. And if we don't fill it with God, our life feels so empty and meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to bring up that verse. And I'm going to bring up that verse in particular when I talk about the pursuit of pleasure and the way that Solomon tried to find the meaning of life in pleasure. Because it's a little different than when he talks about how he tried to find meaning and achievement and great causes. And the quick point about pleasure to kind of that I want to make is again from Tim Keller, is that when there's these great verses when he talks about a pleasure-based life, and it's I think it's in chapter 2, when he says, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure." There's twice in that passage where he says, "My mind still guided me with wisdom."
Yeah.
Like he says, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guided me with wisdom. And then he says again, in all this, my wisdom stayed by me. And then the passage you just read in chapter 3, he set eternity in the human heart. And Keller explains this brilliantly. He says the problem with pleasure is that it's just never enough to drown out the quiet voice in the back of your head that says, it's all pointless. It's all meaningless. In other words, you can't get enough hedonism to drown that out. You can't out pleasure that notion. And so I think people read that passage and they'll say, he says, I did this, I had all these wives, I did all these things, gave my life to pleasure, and all this, my wisdom stood by me. And they say, that doesn't sound like wisdom. That's ridiculous. He's foolish. Why did he do all these things? That's like foolishness, but it's not. The whole point is saying, in all this, my wisdom stood by me, is that even while he was trying to drown it out and trying to find his complete meaning through just endless pleasure, bottomless pleasure, it's not enough. The notion that life is still pointless breaks through, and you can't drown it out.
Yeah. And it's easy to look at other people's pleasures and be like, that's so stupid.
Yes.
Like that's crazy that's yes. What they're giving their lives to.
I don't. I don't know if you.
Everyone's except your own.
That's exactly right. And so it's in the
And
talk.
and that's true with all three of those areas: achievements, causes, because some causes seem stupid.
They do. I remember when we lived in DC, there was a woman who worked for the can industry. She was in the lobbyist, and she kind of took the job because it's a good paying job. She said, our whole reason for existing is to get people to use more cans and not bottles. That's why we're here. And they had a big deal. They were produced a commercial. She said, look, here's our commercial. Our commercials on TV. It was some guy choosing a can instead of a bottle, saying, see, my drink is cold in the aluminum can, whatever. Like, push the cans. And
That's interesting.
even she thought, well, that's kind of silly, but it's a job.
And you have causes like that today, like not using plastic straws.
Some people think that's really important. That's a big cause. I'm doing my part to save the oceans because I don't use plastic straws. Absolutely, right. And other people say, what difference does it make if you use a straw? It's no
How about
big
just not using a straw?
Yeah.
How about just sipping from the cup?
I raise my glass to you right now, Greg. Absolutely. No straw for the record.
So,
but that point, by the way, I think just if you ever see people towing things on the highway behind them, some big contraption, whatever it is, it's a boat, it's a 4x4, it's something you think, what? Something that you would never do. And someone just spent a ton of money. They're towing their big contraption thing to some other place to do something else. So like all the hassle, all the money to do that thing. And the phrase I did come up with this is original. So I've said this for years. If it's, and I'm going to use it when I give the talk, is stupid is what I wouldn't do.
Yeah, stupid is what I wouldn't do.
Stupid is what I wouldn't do. If I wouldn't do it, it's stupid, right? I would never go camping like that. I would never go for the 4x4. I wouldn't get a jet ski. Who tows behind the big boat or whatever it is that you wouldn't do?
Yeah, that's right? So true. That's so true. And don't you think that applies to all those areas though? Achievement, causes, and pleasure.
It definitely does. And I hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it right now. But you're right. I was going to use
some people that are like what they're trying to achieve, like getting in the Guinness Book of World Records, for killing, I don't know, juggling the most basketballs or something. Some of those achievements seem so silly. Oh. But which of those three do you feel like you tend to fall towards?
Oh, achievement.
Yeah,
it's always been that way. I mean, so
that's kind of how I feel too.
You feel that way too?
Yeah, because I think in ministry, like being successful,
really,
is I mean, you really want to be successful.
Interesting.
Which is something you fight, because I think biblically it's not about worldly success, it's about faithfulness.
Absolutely.
Faithfulness is what matters. There's many godly men and women who've served in really small ministries, but they've made incredible impacts just because they've been faithful to what God has called them to do. At the same time, there's been people that have had incredibly large seemingly impacts and successful in the worldly eyes. They get on TV and and then you find out their lives are like, they're not really
they're in it for the money.
It's empty. Right. Yeah, it's just empty. But
that's interesting, Greg, because I wouldn't have thought of that. I would have put you down as cause based. Because of the ministry, always seems like you could always say, well, I mean, we both know that it's not the way to draw your righteousness, but it's easy to say, I am not caught up like those people in their achievement. I am working for the Lord for a great cause.
Well, I think causes, it's interesting to think about just Christian ministry in general in all three areas. Mm-hmm. Because there's definitely maybe those two are kind of equal pulls on me. But and then the pleasure, how does pleasure work out in and for somebody that's
May not be a driver for you. It's I remember, and I think I want to try to tell this story if I remember it when I'm speaking. I remember witnessing to a guy in college, and Larry Crabb's books were out at the time. Remember Larry Crabb?
Yes.
And he had his
And
big
his
friend.
wife is, oh, his ex-wife, I'm a crab. I'm just kidding.
Larry, if
No,
you're listening, Larry, if you're listening, we're so sorry.
yeah, actually, Larry, that was a joke. I know. I don't. I think Larry was very faithful to his wife, and he actually wrote some really good stuff. But
Yeah,
what was the you
I met
remember
him
the name of the
actually.
book?
No, it was his. I think it was his first book. It was a big hit in Christian circles, but this was like the '80s, right? This is a while ago. But his big catchphrase was that everybody lives for two things: significance and security. Everybody craves two things. And that just made so much sense intuitively to people. People were like, wow, it caught on like wildfire. People are saying, do you realize there's two things people live for? Significance and security. And I remember I was sharing Christ with a friend of mine, and I was talking about that, hoping that he would say, how do I find significance and security as well, be able to share the gospel? And I said, there's two things people live for, significance and security. He said, what about having fun? So I just want to have a good time. I don't care about that stuff. Yeah, like I'm an 18-year-old college student. I just want to have a good time. Like, what the heck? And they realize like a lot of people don't live for that. They live for, and I think actually this is kind of predominant view now. Everyone says this generation lives for experiences. Everyone says you only go around once, YOLO, right? You only go around once. So, you gotta.
The book you mentioned might be Inside Out.
Inside Out. That is what it is. Larry Crabb.
Inside
Out. So
yeah, and then there was that book. The same time was The Search for Significance.
Oh, really?
There was another big book that had the same truth. But you're right. You're right. There is a but
it's very heavy. It's very meaty. It's like thinking people say you're right, significance. But a lot of people say, bag that. I just want everybody. Remember that song it was 80s or 90s. Everybody's working for the weekend.
Yeah.
Remember? Another song. What's her name? Sheryl Crow. All I want to do is have some fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I'm here to tell you, I'm not the only one.
Right.
And just have a good time. Right. But I think
are we saying that like these three areas that come out in the book of Ecclesiastes are still relevant today?
Absolutely, because I think that people, absolutely, because what he's trying to say is, first of all, we should have started this way. He's trying to look at life under the sun, right? So
under the sun. So from like an earthly perspective,
right? Not the heavenly perspective, the earthly perspective, right? Under the sun is like, let's think of what this world is like if there's no God.
Like apart from God.
Apart from
God, you look at life and you try to make as much money as you can. But what is it all for? You can't take it with you.
Right. So it's meaningless.
Apart from God, you give yourself to a cause.
Right.
And you work for the cause, and then it's that's really important to. So would you say that that's part of like the wisdom of Solomon? Like when he's writing this book, he's basically trying to help us see that like remove God from the equation,
right?
And life, no matter how successful, how good you are, or what you give your life to, you can't find any meaning in it.
Let's just say what he's exactly. So he's saying, look, remove God from the equation. Let's look at life under the sun, not the heavenly perspective, earthly perspective, So, but without God, I will try to find meaning in the three major ways people try to find meaning in their lives, right? A pleasure-based life, first though, an achievement-based life, a cause-based life, and then a pleasure-based life. And he said, I'm here to tell you it won't work. It's still meaningless. It's still pointless. You find that you could achieve all these great things, and we can go through some passages. You can achieve these great things. You're going to leave it to a fool who comes after you. You could create all these great causes, and no matter what you do, no one will remember you. And the generations that's come that won't remember you, they will be remembered by the later generations that come after them. Everything will be forgotten. Everything's pointless. And Keller does such a great job of pointing this out. He'll say what he's doing is he's stepping back and taking the big picture. He's saying, I looked at it all, right? Not in part, because at any given part, you could say, this part of my life makes sense, right? This one individual component of my life makes sense. Like why do you go to work? Well, so I can afford to pay the rent. Well, why to pay the rent? So I can have a place to sleep. Well, why do you go to sleep? So I can be rested. Why do you need to be rested? So I can go to work. In any one component of that, you could say that has meaning, but when you look at the step back and look at the whole thing, the way the Ecclesiastes writer does, he says, you look at the whole picture altogether, it's all meaningless. It doesn't make sense. There's no hope. There's no point to life. And you could try these ways of doing it, achievement-based, cause-based, or pleasure-based, and you're going to find, like I did, it's still pointless. There's no meaning. Now, what makes it tricky, and this is the hard part of Ecclesiastes, is, he starts off by saying, let me look at life under the sun. So you could say, well, you could do that now as a thought experiment. Get Christians together and you could say, well, let's just imagine there's no God, right? Like the John Lennon song, Imagine There's No Heaven, right? And let's just talk about what that would look like, what that world would look like. But it's not a book where he doesn't mention God, not like the book of Esther, where the word God never shows up. He talks about God a lot.
That was one of the things I was thinking of as you were talking is, yeah, he kind of sprinkles God throughout the book. It's not even like, it's not the punchline at the end. It's like,
no,
he kind of just like the whole chapter, like 90% of it will be about just that earthly perspective, but then he'll put like a couple verses,
yep,
about he mentions God. Do you want to, any of those like really stand out to you in your research, or
yeah, there's
mention some of those verses
if I can find some now, but it's confusing. It's confusing enough if you read it for the first time, you don't get that under the sun part. It's super confusing. You say, this book seems to say life is meaningless and pointless and everybody dies, and that's, there's no afterlife, and so there's no point to anything. There's no difference between human beings and animals because they're all the same because everybody dies. And you say, this seems so inconsistent with the whole rest of the Bible. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then you say, no, someone explains to you, no, but he's saying it's under the sun, you see. It's all about what life is like if there's no God. Oh, okay, I get that.
So like chapter 2, verses 20, starting in verse 24.
Yes.
A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. So there's that heavenly perspective. For without God, who can eat or find enjoyment? To give the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. So, yeah, I don't know. It's cool.
So the image I have, well, someone, our friend, Dr. Bob Mosteller, actually gave me this image. He said, think about Ecclesiastes like someone who's trying to explain how the sky works, but they're inside one of those like sports domes, like a soccer dome where they kind of pump it up and it's opaque and you can't see anything. And maybe there's a couple of holes in it. So I see a little ray of light coming through. There's a drop of water coming through. So I can't really see. And that's the perspective. And that kind of person is trying to describe how the atmosphere works. I thought that's a pretty good analogy. But another one is like, I think of like cloud cover, because we're here in where we live in the
Northeast Ohio,
second most cloud cover in the United States. The most common weather pattern is overcast gray skies. And you think about someone like that under overcast trying to explain it. And I feel like he's like staying below the clouds for most of it and then going above the clouds once in a while and catching a glimpse of what the blue sky is like. And then dropping down below the clouds and talking about, so he's going above and below the clouds through the whole.
Is there a progression?
I don't I don't know. I'm not sure I see the progression. Like there's a conclusion at the end, a definite
Like the conclusion at the end. Do you feel like that's the real punch?
The progression probably is, he says in chapter, the things about the cause-based life, achievement-based life, pleasure-based life are in chapter 2. So chapter 1 is like, it's all meaningless. Chapter 2 is very much, I tried these 3 ways to find meaning in life. They don't work. Then like there's a number of chapters, like the next through 11. There are his wisdom sayings, like Proverbs. And some of those are like above the clouds and some are below the clouds. Right? So he'll say things like, whatever your hand finds to do, do with all your might, because there's no activity in the grave where you're going. Like there's no afterlife. Say surely a live dog is better than a dead lion because death conquers everything. Like, okay, that part's not, that's below the sun thinking. I get it. I got that. But then other things he's saying, like, have great composure in front of the king, because composure allays great offenses. Okay, good wisdom. That sounds like, timeless wisdom. Maybe it's above the clouds, but he's constantly drifting above and below the clouds through that wisdom part. And it's kind of hard to understand the wisdom part of it, but understand that he's still taking that perspective sometimes of drifting below the clouds and looking at as if there's no God. So I think that's, even if you get the under the sun thing, it's still a challenge as a Christian to read Ecclesiastes.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.